Welcome back. Now, before we continue, we've made an awful lot of changes in C++. Now, if you do this and you've been hot reloading every time and you haven't actually done a proper compile for a while, it's a good idea to close the editor and actually compile from Visual Studio. So Control F5 to actually compile and launch again. And that's because we're not really compiling when we live code, when we press the hot reload button. What we're actually doing is we're hot reloading within the editor and our Visual Studio project remains uncompiled. So what happens is if you go and close the editor and open it up again, some of your changes that you've made in C++ will be gone, and that's because we've never actually compiled those changes. We've been hot reloading the whole time. So hot reloading is great for while you're developing, as it's faster, it's easier, but once in a while, close the editor down and do a proper compile from Visual Studio. All right, that being said, it's now time to see if we can get a camera component onto our pawn. So let's go into BP Bird. Now, we'll do this in Blueprints first, as it's easier to introduce the concept, and then we'll do it in C++ after we've already seen what it is we're trying to do. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to look for a camera. So I'm going to select my capsule component because it's great to attach things to the root component as we want them to move along with the root. So if we go ahead and click plus add and search for camera, then here is a camera component. Here's what it looks like. Now, what we can do with this camera is we can give it an offset by dragging it back. And if we press play, now we can see the bird that we're controlling. So this is great. And if we wanted to, we can move that camera up and angle it down. And then we have a bit of a almost top-down view. So that's something we could do. It's easy, it's quick, but it's not the best way to do this. The best way is to actually not attach the camera directly to the root, but attach it to something else called a spring arm. Let's click plus add here and search for spring arm. And here we see the spring arm component. Now I'm going to take my spring arm component, click and drag it on up onto the capsule so it's attached to the capsule. And I'm going to then take my camera and drag it onto the spring arm. Now, the offset is all out of whack because we adjusted it here in the viewport, so we need to zero out the camera's transform. So what we can do is come up to the transform and hit the curved arrow to re-zero the location and hit the curved arrow to re-zero the rotation. So now that our camera's transform is zeroed out, we can select our spring arm, and our spring arm is out of whack as well. So we're going to go ahead and reset those as well. And now we see what this looks like. We have our spring arm selected, and this is it. This is a spring arm. It looks like a red line connecting our root component to our camera component. Now, why do we want to use a spring arm instead of just moving the camera back? Well, the spring arm has lots of benefits. For one, when our camera collides with something like a wall, our spring arm will shrink down. And that allows us to zoom in on the character when a wall gets in the way so we can still see our pawn. And it also has other options. We can offset it. We can set the target arm length with this target arm length variable. It's got all sorts of built-in features. So whenever we want to offset the camera, we use a spring arm and we use target arm length to control that. And this makes it really easy if we want to control the distance to the camera dynamically at runtime, for example. If we wanted to zoom in to be a first-person shooter or zoom out to be a top-down and switch between the two at runtime, we could do that by dynamically changing the target arm length. So this is very useful, and we can rotate the spring arm component instead of the camera, and the camera will always be facing in the direction of that spring arm. So let's go ahead and click play, and now we see that we can control the bird and we have our camera. And I'd just like to show you the zoom in effect. If we go ahead and place some geometry here, I'm going to go ahead and just select this floor, hit the E key, and hold Alt as I rotate it up by 90 degrees so I can duplicate it. And then I can move it over to behind our pawn. And if we press play and back up, then you'll see that the camera zooms in because it's colliding with that wall. All right, so this is looking great. Now, I mentioned that we wanted to do this in C++. This is a C++ course after all. So we don't want to just add this here in Blueprints. We want to learn how to do it in C++. So I'm going to select spring arm and camera and hit the delete key and remove those. And we're going to hop back into our Visual Studio project to add our camera and spring arm components. So let's go to bird.h and we'll scroll down here to the private section. And these are going to be private variables. Now, the first variable is going to be our spring arm component. And spring arm component is based on uSpringArm component. This is going to be a pointer, and we can call this spring arm. Now, spring arm is a uSpringArm component, which means we need to forward declare this variable since we only want to include the header file for this type when we're using it, when we're actually creating it, as we've learned in previous videos. So we're going to scroll up to the top to our forward declarations here, and we're going to say class uSpringArm component. So now we can use this type as it's now forward declared. Now we also want to be able to see this in Blueprints, so we're going to use visible anywhere. That way we can see it and access its details panel. Now, in addition to the spring arm component, we want a camera, and the type for this is uCamera component. So these are components, all based on scene component, so they have attachment capabilities and so on. We're going to call this viewCamera, and we're also going to make it visible anywhere, and we're also going to forward declare this type uCamera component. So let's do that up here at the top. So class uCamera component. And we'll see that that takes care of the red squiggles. So now we need to construct these, and we do that in the bird constructor. So let's go up to the constructor. Now we know that we're going to need the header files for these types. So I'm going to head over to Unreal Engine documentation and search for them. So first we need the spring arm component. So I'm going to search for uSpringArm component. And I'm going to select uSpringArm component and scroll down to take a look at the include. And we see that it's in Game Framework /SpringArm component. So I'm going to copy that include and paste it at the top of bird.cpp. And now we can use this type. So let's go ahead and create this. Now I'm going to leave AutoPossessPlayer, this line here, at the bottom and construct my spring arm just after my bird mesh. So let's say spring arm equals create default subobject using the uSpringArm component type, and for the name we'll just call this spring arm. And we want to attach this to the capsule. So we can go ahead and call spring arm setup attachment. And we'll use the root component, which is our capsule. Now again, the capsule is the root, so if we said root component here instead, this would be the same thing in this case. Or if we use the public getter get root component, this would also do the same thing. All three of those do the same thing. So it doesn't matter which one we choose. I could leave it like this, and this is more consistent with the way we set up our bird mesh attachment. So I'll leave it like that. So that takes care of the spring arm. And we can also set up some of the spring arm parameters, such as that target arm length. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to take my spring arm, and I'm going to use target arm length. This is a public variable on the uSpringArm component class. And I can set it here. I'm going to set it to 300.f. And if we hover over, we see that this is a float. So we can set it using a float value. All right, so we have our spring arm. It's time to create our camera component. And we call this variable viewCamera. So we need the header file for uCamera component. So we can open our documentation and search for uCamera component. And it's the first thing that pops up, and we can scroll down to our include here, which says that it's in camera/camera component.h. So we're going to include that just under our spring arm component. And now we can use the camera component class, and we're going to do that. And just like our other components, we're going to say view camera equals, and why don't you go ahead and just finish it out? You know how to do this already, so type it on out, see if you get it right. All right, so you probably started typing create default subobject, passing in view camera component, and we can give this its internal name. We'll call this view camera. Now for the attachment. Remember, we want our view camera attached to the spring arm. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to take view camera and call setup attachment. And we're simply going to attach it to spring arm. So let's go ahead and save this and hop back into the editor and see what happens when we hot reload. All right, so we finished hot reloading. Let's go to BP Bird. And here we have our variables. And notice now that they have parentheses with that internal name, and that's because these are C++ variables. Now, when we select the spring arm component, we should see tons of details here in the details panel. And if it's blank like this, this is actually a bug. And there's a pretty easy way to fix this bug. Sometimes this happens in Unreal Engine, even in Unreal Engine 5. But the fix is relatively simple. What we do is change the variable name. So we call this spring arm, but we can change its name. Now, a common name for spring arms is camera boom. So we can rename this to camera boom. And if we rename it here, that means we need to rename it everywhere we're using it, which is in the constructor. So instead of calling it spring arm, we can call it camera boom, and we're accessing spring arm here. Now it's called camera boom, same right here. And the last place we're using it is when we're attaching our view camera to it. So we're going to rename this to camera boom as well. And since we're calling this camera boom now, we don't have to rename its internal text name, but we can. So I'm going to go ahead and do that just because. Now, if I go ahead and save all, so we'll go ahead and close out of the editor and do a hard compile. So Control F5, and we'll go ahead and launch the editor back up. And we can go ahead and open up our BP Bird. And now we see our camera boom, and our view camera is attached to it. So it's an annoying bug, but if you ever do see your details panel empty like that when it shouldn't be, rename the variable and that will fix it. Now in our viewport, we can see our camera attached to our camera boom. Everything looks great. We can even rotate our camera boom if we wish. We can hit the rotation icon and rotate our camera boom up just a bit. And we can alter the target arm length if we want to do that. So we can override those values in Blueprints. And if we ever want it back to our C++ value that we set in the constructor, we hit the arrow icon and it resets it back to its defaults, as the values that we set in C++ are now its defaults. That's the value given to the class default object that this blueprint is based on. Now back in the viewport, I'm selecting my bird, and for some reason my camera is stuck right there in the center, and that isn't looking right. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete my BP bird from the world and open my content drawer and bring another one in there. And now it looks like it should. So if things ever don't look like they should, now that could be due to that bug we just experienced. So if something ever doesn't look like it should, go ahead and first of all close the editor and recompile, see if that doesn't help. Then if your blueprint still looks wonky, go ahead and delete it from the world and bring it back in. So now we have our BP bird back. I'm going to bring it up a bit. And now that this is a brand new BP bird, we do want to check to make sure that auto possess player is set. And of course it's not. So we're going to go ahead and set that to player 0. Now we did set this in C++. So why didn't it get set automatically when we dragged one in? And the reason is because if we select BP bird and click on BP bird self and search for auto possess player, in fact it's right here, this is set to disabled because it was already set here in Blueprints, and then we went and changed it in C++, but the blueprint always overrides the C++ variable. And to make sure that our C++ changes take effect, we can simply hit the curved arrow, and now we get that default value that we assigned in C++ set here on the blueprint. So that arrow is a good way of getting the proper value from the class default object, which is based on our C++ class, and populating that variable. So we set that here in the blueprint. We know it's set here on BP bird in our world. If we press play now, we're possessing the bird and we can fly back and forth. And this looks great. All right, so that's going to wrap it up for this video. We now have a camera and spring arm. We still can't steer our bird, so that's a little frustrating. We'd like to be able to, say, move the mouse and control where the bird goes. So we're going to take care of that in the next video. I'll see you soon.